Christmas Eve 2002, a pregnant woman disappeared from her California home. Within months, the case would become a national obsession. A husband would become the focus of suspicion. And a courtroom battle, well, it would raise questions that continue today. Stay with us as we examine the evidence in the Scott Peterson case. And there will be new evidence introduced with those questions asked. This and more on today's podcast. I'm Charlie, and this is Charlie Investigate.
The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals participating and do not represent those of city, county, state, or federal law enforcement agencies, nor sponsors and platforms of this presentation. The Charlie Crime Buster name and all forms and abbreviations are property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent unless or until found guilty in a court of law. This presentation contains adult subject matter. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
Some stories refuse to fade with time. They linger. Not because all the questions have been answered, but because some continue to be asked decades later. The Scott Peterson case is one of those stories. More than 20 years after Lacey Peterson disappeared on Christmas Eve 2002, these are all working to bring this back into the spotlight. In this special 4-part Charlie Investigate series, we'll return to the beginning, not to relive the headlines, but to examine the evidence, revisit the investigation, and ask a simple question. What do we know today that we didn't know then? I appreciate you being here with me for this investigation. If you find value in the work we do on Charlie Crime Buster, I would ask you to support the show by subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing it with others. These simple actions make a big difference because they help the podcast reach people who are interested in looking beyond the headlines and exploring the evidence, the questions, and the stories behind these cases. Thank you for your support. It truly helps keep this work going.
The following podcast is brought to you by PeacemakerNetwork.com. PeacemakerNetwork.com. Audio is provided by Pixabay.com. That's Pixabay.com.
At Charlie Crime Buster Investigates, we always want to remind ourselves that the crimes that we report on, well, they involve real people, real lives, and 2 people lost their lives in this case. Let me tell you about Lacey. Lacey Denise Rocha was born in 1975 in California. She grew up in the Modesto area. And before Lacey Peterson became known around the world because of a tragic investigation, the people who knew her remembered someone very different from the name that would later appear in the headlines. They described Lacey as outgoing, energetic, someone who brought life into a room. Friends often recalled that Lacey was a person who helped organize gatherings, who made ordinary moments, made them feel special. She enjoyed being surrounded by people, celebrating milestones in their lives, and of course, creating memories with her family and her friends. She was known for her smile, her enthusiasm, and her ability to make others feel included. That personality was reflected in the life she was building there in Modesto. She loved decorating, gardening, cooking, and preparing for the future that she had imagined with Scott and their unborn son, Connor. To those closest to her, Lacey was not simply the subject of a famous case. No, she was a daughter, a friend, a wife, a woman who was excited about becoming a mother. Her family often talked about Lacey's ability to make people smile. Her brother Brent remembered something Lacey once said about how she wanted to be remembered. She said, "When I die, I don't want people missing me. I want people to be happy." I believe these words, it provides to us a glimpse into the person her family knew. A woman who loved life, loved people. Her mother, Sharon Rocha, said she wanted the world to know Lacey, not just the details of the case, but the person her daughter truly was. Scott Lee Peterson was born on October 24, 1972 in San Diego, California. And long before Scott Peterson became one of the most recognizable defendants in modern America criminal history, well, he simply was a young man from California who excelled at golf, studied agriculture business at Cal Poly, and he appeared to be building a comfortable life with his wife, Lacey. Few who met him during those years could have imagined that his name would one day become synonymous with one of the country's most debated murder cases. Scott grew up as the youngest child in a large blended family, where he was often described as the baby of the family. His father, Lee Peterson, owned a small business. They would package crates. His mother, Jackie Peterson, she had previously operated a little store before helping with the family business. The Peterson family was considered solid middle class. One of the early memories of Scott was his love for golf. He started at a very young age. By his teens, he was an excellent golfer. Some people believed he had the potential to play at a very high level. He was disciplined and highly competitive. But golf also taught him patience, concentration, and composure under pressure. Those qualities people later viewed differently once he became the subject of a criminal investigation. Scott attended local schools in Southern California before enrolling at Arizona State University on a partial golf scholarship. But he later transferred to Cal Poly. There he studied agriculture business. Now, people who knew Scott during those years, they often described him as friendly, polite, soft-spoken, athletic, someone who generally got along with others. Others remembered him as private and not especially expressive. In short, my friend, there was little in Scott Peterson's childhood or early adulthood, that suggested his life would one day become the focus of America's most closely watched murder trials. Friends remembered an easygoing young man with a talent for golf, supportive parents, and plans for a successful career. I guess we could say in many ways his story appeared unremarkable. At least until it intersected with one of the most infamous criminal investigations of the 21st century. Scott and Lacey's story together began in the mid-1999s at Polytech State University in San Luis Obispo. Lacey, who was studying horticulture, was working part-time at a restaurant when she met Scott, who, of course, as we mentioned earlier, was studying agriculture business. Friends, they recalled an immediate connection between them. According to Lacey's mom, Sharon, Lacey was so taken up with Scott, she said, "Mom, I met the man I'm going to marry." At the time, Scott, he reportedly told friends he just wasn't sure whether he was the marrying type or not. Yet, that relationship, as most do, quickly deepened. They dated throughout their college years, sharing common interests, and they were building a life together. It was 1997 when they married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. And like many young couples just starting out, they settled into married life with dreams of building a life together. It was marriage that marked the beginning of a new chapter for Scott and Lacey Peterson. Like many young couples, they settled into the routines of everyday life, building careers, buying a home in Modesto, and planning for the future. Friends and family, they saw the couple establishing the kind of life that many people hope for. A comfortable home, steady jobs, close family ties, and dreams of becoming parents. Family members have described Lacey's excitement about becoming a mother. She talked about baby names, imagined what a life with Connor would be like, and she looked forward to celebrating her first Christmas the following year. Friends noticed the joy that she found in preparing for his arrival, Connor's, that is. She would shop for baby items, she would decorate the nursery, and she would imagine all those routines of family life, that were just weeks away. As Christmas approached, Lacey was entering the final weeks of her pregnancy. That anticipation that fills so many homes before the birth of a first child, well, it just seemed to surround the Peterson household as well. There was every reason to believe that the next time the family gathered, well, there would be one more place there at the table. Just imagine the Peterson home in days before Christmas. Wrapped presents beneath the tree. A nursery waiting for its newest occupant. Baby clothes folded into drawers. A calendar counting down not just to Christmas morning, no, but to the birth of a little boy named Connor. On the morning of December, all those plans were still intact. By nightfall, everything had changed. For Scott and Lacey Peterson, it should have been a day filled with anticipation. Yes, should have been. Christmas was only hours away, and in a few short weeks they expected to welcome their first child into the world. But instead, December the 24th, 2002, would become one of the most closely examined days of their lives. According to Scott Peterson, the morning began quietly. He later told investigators that Lacey was watching Martha Stewart on television while he prepared to leave the house. That simple description may not sound remarkable, but over the next several years, investigators would examine nearly every statement that Scott Peterson made about that morning. As Christmas Eve 2002 began, Lacey Peterson appeared to be preparing for an ordinary holiday day at home. According to accounts shared during the investigation, she had plans included spending time around the house, completing some Christmas preparations, and, of course, getting ready for the arrival of her first child, Connor. According to reports, she walked the dog, she mopped the kitchen floor, she was preparing for Christmas dinner. It was reported that the clothes she was wearing was black pants and a white blouse. Getting ready for Christmas, just like all the kinds of stuff that many families do. Then, Scott leaves. Now, at the moment Scott drove away from the Peterson home, neither he nor anyone else could have imagined that the investigators would spend the next 20 years trying to determine exactly what happened during those hours that followed. What seemed like an ordinary Christmas Eve would later become one of the most closely examined days in modern criminal history. Every decision, every conversation, and every reported detail from that day would eventually be reviewed by investigators, attorneys, and even a jury, trying to answer one question: what happened to Lacey Peterson? According to Scott Peterson's account, he left the Peterson home on Christmas Eve to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. At that time, there was nothing about that morning that suggested that that day would become the turning point in one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in America. But as the afternoon unfolded, small details, they began to take on greater importance. Neighbors later became a part of the timeline that investigators would carefully examine. One of those details involved the Petersons' dog, Mackenzie, who was found wandering in the neighborhood. The dog was returned to the Peterson property, but Lacey was nowhere to be found. At first, there was no clear explanation for why a heavily pregnant woman preparing for Christmas would leave home without the dog, without her purse, and without any obvious indication of where she had gone. As the hours passed, the concern grew. Family members and friends began searching. What initially appeared as a missing person situation, it quickly became more urgent. Investigators would later focus closely on the timeline of that day, the moments before Scott left, the time he was away, and the window of opportunity between Lacey being seen and accounted for, or the discovery that she was still missing. You see, the Peterson family, they believed they were searching for a missing wife and daughter. They did not yet know they were at the beginning of a case, would capture the attention of the entire country. And that's where the questions begin. Before we continue with the investigation, It's time for a tradition that longtime Charlie Crimebuster listeners have come to expect. For the past several years, we've taken a brief moment to step away from the heavier side of crime and remind ourselves, well, that sometimes criminals are their own worst enemies. So let's take a short break and enjoy this week's edition of Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. A bizarre probation arrest is getting plenty of attention on Facebook after the Flagler County Sheriff's Office, they shared body camera footage showing a suspect allegedly trying to explain away a fake drug testing device. Deputies said they watched him pull it from his pants. The video is unusual enough on its own, but what really sets it apart is the way that the sheriff, Rick Stacy, and his team up in Flagler County told it on Facebook. There, you might say, a steady stream of puns and one-liners. Well, it makes it clear that deputies there and all over the state of Florida, they've heard about every excuse before this one. Now, before anyone writes us off as only in Florida, it's worth remembering that strange arrests happen. They happen in every corner of the country. Florida deputies, they just happen to be especially good at telling stories. And the Flagler County Sheriff's Office, it does another good example here. Before the body camera begins, the footage that is, Shepard had already been arrested after a deputy had stopped him as he pulled into his court-ordered drug treatment class on July the 14th. Deputies say he had driven there on a suspended license, by the way, which also violated a felony probation that he was already serving for multiple burglary and theft convictions. During the ride, Shepard tells the deputy that his shoulders bothered him. Trying to make him more comfortable, the deputy moves the handcuffs from behind his back to the front so he can adjust his position. That courtesy quickly backfired. Instead, the deputy noticed Shepard pulling something from his pants, a concealed device, tossed it onto the patrol car's floorboard. He said, "I have you on video pulling out this device out of your pants, okay?" The deputy says, "I'm not stupid. I clean this car every day. I'm responsible for what's in this car. I would know if there's a pee bag in my car." Shepard responds by claiming he doesn't know what the device is. And the deputy reminds him he had already asked him if he had anything on his person. Short story, no pun intended there. The guy had already violated parole, and now he was trying to cheat his drug tests with a homemade pee bag concealed in his pants. The sheriff up there, he kind of summed it up perfectly. Here's what he said, quote, unquote. "This pea-brain dirtbag had already given the deal of a lifetime. He'd already had given the deal of a lifetime. But now he has a stream of new charges after flushing away a second chance to turn his life around. Instead, he tried to trick the system. Now he needs to go to prison." And that, my friend, is Charlie's Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. That was our moment to step away. Now let's return to the investigation. As the search for Lacey Peterson continued, what began as a missing person case, it was about to become a national story. And questions surrounding that Christmas Eve, those questions would only grow. At first, this was a family's nightmare, shared by a community. Goal was simple: find Lacey Peterson, bring her home. But as with any missing person investigation, you often focus on the neighborhood where Lacey was last seen. The Peterson home sat in a quiet residential neighborhood in Modesto, California. It was a community of tree-lined streets, well-kept homes, and neighbors who recognized one another as they went about their daily routines. In those weeks leading up to Christmas, the neighborhood reflected that ordinary rhythm of suburban life. Families preparing for holidays, homes decorated with lights, and neighbors moving through familiar routines. It was the kind of neighborhood where a missing person case would feel almost impossible to imagine. The Petersons was known as a young couple preparing for the arrival of their first child, and nothing about that setting suggested that one of its homes would soon become the center of national investigation. But on Christmas Eve, 2002, the familiar streets surrounding the Peterson home, well, it would become the focus of searches, interviews, and questions that investigators would spend years trying to answer. As word spread that Lacey Peterson was missing, that search quickly grew beyond family and close friends. Neighbors, volunteers, even complete strangers joined together in an effort to find a woman that many of them had never met. The holiday season was interrupted by a growing sense of urgency as people walked the neighborhoods, searched open areas, distributed flyers, looked for any sign that could bring Lacey home. Just the image of Lacey, a young woman 8 months pregnant with her first child. That, my friend, captured the attention and sympathy of people throughout the community. Volunteers gathered because they believed that somewhere, somehow, there had to be a clue that would lead them back to Lacey. Oh, for days, the search continued with one shared hope, that Lacey Peterson would be found alive and return to the family waiting for her. Now remember, Christmas Day is a time for families gathering and celebrating. But in the town of Modesto, families were searching desperately. Volunteers were walking the street and community, looking for an expected mother. It became one of the largest community searches in California history. And one of the most visible faces of the search was Lacey's mom, Sharon. She bravely faced the public, and in the midst of her anguish, realized that keeping Lacey in the public eye was one of the best ways to find her. She appealed for information, and she helped to keep the focus on finding her daughter. You see, this was a case that quickly people could identify with. It was a young married couple. They had a baby on the way. It was a time that they were preparing for Christmas. Christmas always seems to bring communities together. And a woman who disappeared from what appeared to be an ordinary neighborhood, well, it certainly resonated with the public. The first days after Lacey Peterson disappeared, well, they were filled with hope, fear, and unanswered questions. A community came together searching for this young woman who was 8 months pregnant, who was preparing to welcome her first child into the world. Family members waited for answers. Volunteers searched the streets. Investigators worked to piece together those events of Christmas Eve. Well, at this point, the case was still a missing person investigation. The most important question remained the simplest one. Where was Lacey Peterson? But as investigators began to look more closely at the timeline of that day, the focus of the investigation would begin to change. The details surrounding Christmas Eve, the movements, the statements, and the events leading up to Lacey's disappearance, well, it would become the foundation of a case that would capture the attention of the entire nation. In our next episode of Charlie Investigates, we will examine the investigation that followed, the evidence, the questions, and the turning points that transformed the search of a missing woman. Transformed it into one of the most closely watched criminal cases in America.
Florida has warm weather throughout the year, and having an air conditioning system is important. Whether it's summer or winter, you'll always need your air handling system. Breezy Air Incorporated provides both commercial and residential air conditioning solutions. Solutions that are built for your comfort needs. Call Jack at 407-283-2327. You see, Breezy Air provides solutions that bring cool comfort and reliable service to their customers. Preventive care can also lengthen the life of your AC unit, and believe it or not, Breezy Air provides annual service packages. So call them today, 407-283-2327. That's 407-283-2327.
Until next time, let me remind you ask questions, and follow evidence. I'm Charlie, and this is Charlie Investigates.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. We would like to thank our sponsor, the Peacemaker Network, and also encourage you to support the first responders, military, and law enforcement personnel by contributing to the Peacemaker Network. That's peacemakernetwork.com. All music and sound effects are courtesy of Pixabay.com. That's Pixabay.com. You can also support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, tag @CharlieCrimebuster, and then click the subscribe button. By doing so, you'll be notified each time we drop one of our shows. Another more convenient way for you to listen to our podcasts, or for you to say to your smart speaker, play Charlie Crimebuster. If you have comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you, so please send them to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com, or you can call or text us at 407-917-2211. That's 407-917-2211. Thank you for listening, and we hope that you will join us again for another exciting crime episode with Charlie Crimebuster.